Alhamdulillah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. Let me translate that into English. Peace and blessings upon everybody who's watching this show. Welcome to today's powerful show by the will of God. We've got a very interesting show, as you can see. Let me just mention a British proverb, which I actually learned a couple of days ago. Facts are a stubborn thing. And these two individuals are based upon facts. And I've witnessed over the last couple of months these two knowledgeable gentlemen that when they speak with facts. And like I said, it's a stubborn thing. But once again, thank you guys for joining us. I'm going to pass the mic on to my co-host, Brother Yusuf, from all the way from South Africa. Brother Yusuf, the mic's all yours.
Well, thank you for that, Mohammed, and thank you and to all the viewers out there. This is the South African Debate Initiative in coordination with Cove FF Channel, bringing you Professor Norman Finkelstein. Professor Finkelstein is an American political scientist and activist. His primary fields of research are in the politics of the Holocaust and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And he rose to prominence in 2000 after publishing The Holocaust Industry, a book which he writes how the memory of the Holocaust is exploited as an ideological weapon to provide Israel a degree of immunity from criticism. His most recent book is published, as I stand subject to correction, in 2018, Gaza, an Inquest into its Martyrdom. Professor Finkelstein, it's a privilege and an honor to have you. Good evening, or should I say rather good afternoon to you.
Either is fine. Just a small correction. I've written a couple of books since the Gaza and Inquest into its Martyrdom, but for our purposes today, that's the most pertinent book.
Fantastic. Well, let me start off with this, and I know that your time is at a premium and it's pretty limited. Just this week, and I think it's crucial to raise this, on the 15th of May, we had a situation where, Palestinians across the globe are marking the 76th anniversary of the Nakba, the kind of catastrophe. And simultaneously to that, you have a situation where just on Tuesday, prior to the application that's now being brought, we see South Africa again. A group of far-right Israelis, including a number of government ministers, have essentially called for the resettlement of Gaza, Itamar Ben-Gvir. So what my question, maybe to start this off, to kick it off, we've got a significant event in Palestinian history, reaching its anniversary this week. It's a horrific event. And what's very shocking about it is that, in a sense, it was an internationally sanctioned event, byproduct of policy by the British Mandate, the League of Nations, and all of that. So to start off with this, what would your take be on the irony of the particular comments being made by these far-right extremists in the Israeli Knesset, the particular role that Israel is playing at this juncture, and of course the fact that we are experiencing something equivalent or worse than the Nakba?
I would say as a first comment that since the inception of Israel's genocide in Gaza, there has been a significant modification in the international discourse on the subject of the Israel-Palestine conflict. I would say up until October 7th, 2023, the discourse was mostly, at least within the mainstream political and judicial organs, the mainstream discourse was basically based on June 1967 and then the UN Resolution 242, which is to say the essence of UN Resolution 242 was to say that everything within Israel pre-June 1967 was legitimate under international law, whereas everything after June 1967, namely the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, that was not legitimate under international law. The occupied Palestinian territories, as it's called in the formal legal literature on the topic, OPT, the Occupied Palestinian Territories. So basically, what was called into question after UN Resolution 242 was not Israel itself, but the occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. Since October 2023, since October 7th, 2023, in the face of the genocide that Israel unleashed in Gaza, it's more and more becoming clear that the terms for a settlement are no longer being described or delineated as UN Resolution 242, but now the whole legitimacy of the Zionist enterprise to create a Jewish state in Palestine, the legitimacy of that whole enterprise has now been called into question, which is to say, we're now back to 1948. Up until October 7th, I would say 1948, except for the refugee issue, up until October 7th, except for the refugee issue, 1948 was a done deal. It was legitimized under international law. I would say now it's no longer a done deal. And it's indicative of that fact that there has been a tension in the South African presentation before the International Court of Justice. On the one hand, if you listen to the first speaker, is he your Attorney General? I can't remember his name.
The first speaker was, I think it was the ambassador that spoke initially. And then, of course,
to the Hague.
There was Professor John Dugard, Max Duplessis, and
I mean just the first speaker, the ambassador to the Hague. You will notice that two things are going on in his presentation, both this time and also on January 26th, both this time and during the first public sitting. He keeps going back to 1948. He refers to Israel as a settler colonial regime and a discriminatory regime. For him, the starting point is not 1967. The starting point is 1948. On the other hand, at least up until now, the South African delegation has continued to state that it supports a two-state settlement on the basis of UN Resolution 242. So in my opinion, there is a tension in the South African position about whether or not they want to go back to the terms of the settlement set in UN Resolution 242, namely two states on the June 1967 border, and accepting the legitimacy of Israel as a Jewish state, or are they intent, as your ambassador has suggested, that we have to reopen the whole question going back to 1948?
From what I can understand, Professor, I think the South African position is somewhat still conservative on that particular issue. I mean, there are certainly ideologues within the ruling establishment that have had taken a particular position of a single state, a one-state solution. But from a practical point of view, and I think it's been mentioned by a number of people, that the whole notion of a two-state solution, I mean, that door has been closed a long time ago. But it seems that because of the fact that, and certainly for the past 30 years, South Africa has indeed established relationships with Israel. I mean, Nelson Mandela received a doctoral degree from Ben Gurion University, despite the fact that he had been outspoken on the Palestinian right to resistance. But I think that there's an element of conservatism in the official government position. And I think that's probably from the perspective of strategy. that they stick to the so-called in-principle idea of a two-state solution, when in reality the practicalities are, how do you deal with the issue of the settlements on the West Bank? So I think that's a problem. But I just want to take you to this point, which you've kind of tied this up to the Nakba. Now we see for the first time, which I'm not so sure, maybe it was in existence in its past, but for the very first time on a public level and regularly in the discourse in terms of what's been happening on October 7th, you see this kind of Nakba denialism. I know you've debated Benny Morris, the official Israeli historian, and I never knew until recently, in a recent discussion I think he had on a podcast, which you were also on that podcast about a couple of months later, and then they interviewed him, that he basically, came out as a Nakba denialist. And the discussion was on October 7th, not because he disputes the idea that Palestinians were expelled, but because he denies that it was actually part of a plan, in the same way that now in Gaza, what we're witnessing is a kind of a plan unfolding. So my question to you then is that when you have the invocation of the Nakba on the one hand by, for example, the Israeli Knesset member Ariel Kalna, he's calling for a second Nakba. And on the other hand, you juxtapose that with Nakba denialism, that look, nothing of significance happened to the Palestinians. How do you reconcile these two mutually conflicting positions that are emanating from Israeli society?
I don't think you can reconcile them. I think that Benny Morris is being disingenuous, which is the euphemism for he's a liar. Because, and I don't say it gleefully.
He's a liberal, isn't he? He came out as an Israeli liberal.
I would say Professor Morris wears many hats, and it depends on which venue he is in. When he's in the West, he pretends to be a liberal, even though that doesn't pass anymore. And when he's in Israel, he's basically, and I say this carefully, choosing my words, he's basically a murderous thug. Now, you have to bear in mind that Benny Morris has, already as far back as 2000, was calling for the caging in of the Palestinian animals.
Wow.
He's not doing much. You could find it if your listeners are interested. Just Google Benny Morris, then Ari, A-R-I, new word Shavit, S-H-A-V-I-T, and Haaretz, H-A-A-R-E-T-Z. He did a famous interview in which he said all the Palestinians are animals, they need to be caged in. And Benny Morris has in recent years called for nuking Iran. And when the question arises of what about all the people who will be killed, his answer is they asked for it because they elected that government. Now, that's talking about the incineration of tens of millions of people. So within, as I say, when he appears before a Western audience, he starts mouthing these liberal platitudes. But when he's among his own, he's a murderous thug. Now, in this particular question, Benny Morris is himself not particularly consistent, because he has written in one of his books, The Birth of the Palestinian Question Revisited, Palestinian Refugee Question. The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Question Revisited. If you turn to page 46 in that book, he says, and now I'm quoting him, the idea of transfer, which is the euphemism for expulsion, the idea of transfer was inbuilt and inevitable in Zionism. The idea of transfer was inbuilt and inevitable in Zionism. And so that was the core belief of all of the Israeli leadership, or before that, the Yusuf leadership. And then when the opportunity availed itself in 1947 through 49, they acted on that tenet of their ideology, namely, they transferred the Palestinians. So it seems to me that if he acknowledges it was a tenet of the Palestinians, then it's hard to pretend as if what happened in 1948 was what the former Israeli president Weizmann called it. He called it a miraculous clearing of the land. No, it wasn't miraculous. It was acting on one of your core beliefs, one of the tenets of Zionism, namely the idea of transfer was inbuilt and inevitable in Zionism. Now, I would say I do believe there is a slight difference with the situation today and 48. Because in 48, it was impossible to create a Jewish state with an overwhelmingly Arab population. So, as Morris said, if you want a Jewish state, you got to get rid of the Arabs. Nowadays, there was no real conviction among the Israeli elite to expel the population from Gaza on ideological grounds. On ideological grounds, they did want to get rid of the population in the West Bank because they can't create a Jewish state from the Mediterranean to the Jordan with so many Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank. So there was what you might call an ideological imperative. In the case of Gaza, they were perfectly happy with sealing it off and just turning it into a kind of game preserve or concentration camp. However, it is true that Gaza has always been a pinprick at the side of the Israelis. It's what you might call for the Israelis a nuisance. And so every few years, Israel would, as it called it, mow the lawn in Gaza because the grass was getting too high or the Palestinians were getting too uppity. And so they had to be cut down. With October 7th, there was a change among the Israeli leadership. It no longer wanted to cut the grass in Gaza. It wanted to extirpate, that means pull out by the roots. It wanted to extirpate every blade of grass in Gaza. But I would say, people could say the distinction is trivial and it doesn't amount to much difference for practical purposes. But I would say it's slightly different than 1948 because the Israelis had already resolved that they would not incorporate Gaza into the state of Israel. That was a decision that was already made in 2005 when Prime Minister Sharon withdrew the settlers from Gaza. So this is a more, I would call it a practical military consideration that has driven the Israelis vis-a-vis Gaza into basically one of three things. And it's really a continuum. It's not boom, boom, boom. It's kind of a continuum. One is to carry out a massive ethnic cleansing. That doesn't seem in the cards, at least up until now, because of the Egyptian veto. Another possibility is to render Gaza uninhabitable so that, in the words of the former head of Israel's National Security Council, Giora Eiland, the only choice will be for Palestinians to stay and starve or by hook and crook to leave, to figure out a way to leave. And the third possibility is just to wipe out large portions of the population, or as I think Prime Minister Netanyahu put it, to thin out the population in Gaza. So I think that's where we stand right now.
Yeah, I just want to ask this, and then we're going to move on in terms of this analogy. I just realized about a week ago, reading this, I didn't know this, that apparently a lot of members, quite ironical, of the current Israeli government are in fact descendants of the people that created the Nakba. Netanyahu's father, I didn't know, was Benzion Netanyahu, who was a member of Irgun, then Yoav Galant. I believe I read somewhere that his father, in fact, called him or named him up after the Operation Yoav, which was, the depopulation of the southern Palestine. The one thing which I want to maybe, and then we can move on to the next issue, is the classic engagement on the internal audience front. The Israelis are actually talking about genocidal plans openly, and they advocating them. And the South African application, went into detail for that. But the problem that I see in Western media is that they put this out as a kind of a byproduct of the Zionist right. But I mean, to give you an example, the Nakba was committed by the Zionist so-called left, because it was labor Zionism that committed the Nakba. And they were back then presenting the image of self-defense to the external world, but were actually engaging in aggressive ethnic cleansing and advocating internally, history repeating itself. But quite strangely, I think I heard somewhere along the line, this is the first time in your writings or publicly that you've described what is happening in Israel as a genocide. You've never described past actions as being genocidal or, constituting possible genocide. Is that correct?
I've never said it because it's never been accurate, and I tried to be precise and accurate in my language. I would add to that many people...
What's different now, Professor? What's different now?
Well, what's different now is Israel is carrying out as senior European officials, senior humanitarian officials, and even liberals have pointed out that given that, number one, Gallant said from day 2, I think October 9th, the defense minister, we're not letting in any food, fuel, water, or electricity to a population that's sealed off in a concentration camp. We're not allowing in any food, fuel, water, and electricity. Number 2, that policy has not been altered. Already in November, which is a while ago at this point, already in November, late November, Human Rights Watch stated that Israel was using starvation as a weapon of war. Now, by last month, many senior European officials were saying that. Joseph Borrell, the European foreign policy chief, he said that this is a man-made famine. Okay, it's a calculated, orchestrated famine. And if you just let me just remember. Well, there was another. It'll come back to me in a moment. In any case, if you're carrying out a man-made famine, a policy of starvation, and the captive population can't leave, it seems to me impossible not to conclude that this is a genocidal policy. And I would add that even if you take very mainstream figures, for example, if you look at this very mainstream fellow, Aryeh, Aryeh, Neier, Neier, who is a big name, so to speak, in the in the human rights community. He's one of the founders of Human Rights Watch, and he's one of the founders of many, many human rights organizations, and he's very mainstream. In the current issue of the New York Review of Books, he stated that there's no way at this point not to conclude that Israel is systematically starving the population of Gaza, that this is a genocide. So that's no longer, in my opinion, it's no longer a fringe or a quote unquote leftist opinion. It's the opinion of Joseph Borrell. It's the opinion of Aryeh Neier, the New York Review of Books, which is as mainstream as you can get. So I think it would be hard at this point not to call it a genocide. I would also add, by the way, that in the first proceedings at the ICJ on the South African application, the German judge sitting on the court, Nolte, Nolte, in his statement, his separate opinion for the court, he stated that he did not believe Israel was carrying out a genocide. However, he did believe that Israel was violating Article 3 of the Genocide Convention by inciting genocide. So he's made that distinction. However, when the ICJ came before the court on additional provisional measures in March, and in the court order of March 28th, Nolte had notably changed his opinion because of the whole issue of methodical, systematic starvation. And now he said Israel was in violation of Article 2, namely acts of genocide. So when you ask me what caused me to change my opinion, I would say my opinion is based on the same facts that everybody else is now adducing. If you look at my initial statements right after October 7th, when I started to say Israel is committing a genocide, and I was asked to defend it, that statement, I kept saying the same thing. If you deny food, water, electricity, and fuel to a captive population, what is going to happen? That is a no-brainer. You're going to wipe out the population. That has to be your goal. Now, of course, the claim was Israel had modified its policy. It started to admit, under US pressure, and mostly for public relations purposes, it began to admit some humanitarian aid. As I said, to appease President Biden and for PR purposes. However, that did not change the fundamental fact, which is why at the end of November, Human Rights Watch said starvation is being used as a weapon of war. There are some.
I want to pick your brain on that point because this is the application here before me, and I've read it about I think 2 times, and I've tried to analyze it. I believe you may have read it more, but just yesterday at the ICJ, it's like a kind of a theater of the absurd. Just on the point that you're making, but tragic at the same time, that this representative for Israel, in fact, made the claim that there's in fact a flood of humanitarian aid. Now you've got a situation, at least in the past 2 days, that you've got these 2 kind of grim characters at the ICJ, essentially making a pathetic defense, which the entire world knows it's false. There was an attack on South Africa. I know when the first application was brought, and by the way, I'd like to know your comments on the South African application, because this imbecile Admiral John Kirby stated it's baseless, it is fruitless, it is defenseless. But essentially, we're back to square one. That again, to preserve Palestine and its people, despite the fact that there were these interim relief, Israel's genocide has basically continued apace and just reached a new horrific crescendo. My issue is that were you not somewhat disappointed by the initial interim ruling? Because both sides seem to be using this the initial order as propagandas. I know on the Piers Morgan show you had that nutcase Rabbi Shmuley stating that the order dismissed. There was no dismissal of any application. There was a prima facie case held, but it seems that both sides are using the order by the ICJ for propagandist purpose. Were you somewhat at least satisfied with the initial interim relief that was actually provided by the ICJ, in particular Judge Donoghue?
Look, you've asked many questions in that question. You may not realize it, but since there's a lot to say on each aspect of the question that you raised. Let's start with that the January 26th court
This one
order.
here, yeah.
Okay, now on your British program Hard Talk, BBC Hard Talk, Joan Donahue was on the program, and I will say it, and I have no fear of saying it. She flat out lied. It was a flagrant, bold-faced, shameful, and shameless lie when she stated that the court had not found that Israel was plausibly committing genocide. That was a flat out lie. I've just finished a 10-page single-spaced analysis of what the court found on January 26th, and I hopefully will be able to post it and to challenge Joan Donahue on that, the American judge.
I don't want to interrupt your train of thought there, Professor, but just a quick point as a lawyer. What she said on the Hard Talk, which is absolute rubbish. She says that she made the argument, or the interim order should be interpreted that the Palestinians have a plausible right to be protected from genocide. I mean, that's rubbish. You don't have a plausible right to be protected. You have an absolute right to be protected from genocide. And that's the argument she's making.
Well, I don't think she was making an argument. And I'm being very serious about that. This was a careerist, a wretched careerist who was trying to protect herself as she left the ICJ and is now looking for a job in the United States. The basic facts are very simple and they are irrefutable. The basic facts, let's work backwards. First of all, she didn't do anything. There was a vote on that, on those provisional measures. So it was 15 judges versus 2. It was 15 judges who signed on. And she had no business speaking for all 15 judges. But let's put that aside for a moment. Let's take the very essential, basic issue. Let's work backwards instead of forwards. The court issued provisional measures. Under the court's jurisprudence, you cannot issue provisional measures pertaining to the Genocide Convention, which is the only convention that was at stake in these hearings. It wasn't about the laws of war. It wasn't about IHL. It wasn't about war crimes. It wasn't about crimes against humanity. It was only about one thing. It was about genocide, the Genocide Convention. You cannot issue, on the basis of the court's jurisprudence, you can't issue provisional measures in a case around the Genocide Convention unless you have plausibly proven that Palestinian rights were at risk under the Genocide Convention. And the Palestinian rights couldn't have been at risk under the Genocide Convention unless Israel was plausibly committing genocide. That is so simple, so basic, so irrefutable. Once they indicated the provisional measures, it was an acknowledgement that Israel was plausibly committing genocide that put Palestinian rights under the Genocide Convention at risk, which is to say, Palestinians were facing a plausible genocide. If South Africa had not proven that, there couldn't have been provisional measures. That's the whole point. Now, the first provisional measure, the first one, if you look at your, no, you don't have it because you don't have the court order.
I've got it here. I've got my application here. I don't know if you could. You're looking at the screen, the relief that is sought by South Africa, right?
Right.
Let me see if I can share that. I may have it on me. Let's see if I can share it.
If you look at the first provisional order of the court, the very first provisional order, I'll just read it to you.
Yeah.
Okay, here. Article 2 of the Genocide Convention prohibits, Article 2 prohibits what is called acts of genocide. And there are several types of acts of genocide. There is outright killing, there is endangering the civilian population. I'm not going to go through it.
Yeah.
Article 2, the first provisional measure reads, the court considers that with regard to the situation described above in the court order, Israel must, in accordance with its obligations under the Genocide Convention in relation to Palestinians in Gaza, take all measures within its power to prevent the commission of all acts within the scope of Article 2 of this convention. That is to say, if the provisional measure states that Israel must take all measures so as to not breach Article 2, then South Africa must have demonstrated that there was a plausible danger.
It's the genocide.
That Israel was breaching Article 2. If there was no plausible danger that Israel was breaching Article 2, which prohibits acts of genocide, they could not have indicated that provisional measure. There has to be, according to court jurisprudence, there has to be a close link between the provisional measure and the right that's plausibly being violated. Well, what right was plausibly being violated? The right protected under Article 2 against acts of genocide. So her claim that we did not establish that Israel was plausibly committing genocide
ridiculous.
It's completely ridiculous, because then you couldn't have issued provisional measures to protect the Palestinians from what? To protect them from Article 2, acts of genocide.
Genocide. It's like a rule nisi, you know, in an interim order or relief that you're seeking before you get the final order, you get the interim order, or the equivalent from what I can see as a criminal defense lawyer, where the prosecution has established a prima facie case before you go for trial. But the one disappointment that a lot of us felt, and probably it's because of the fact that the ICJ cannot implement orders, is the primary relief being sought by South Africa in the application, the first relief being sought, that the state of Israel immediately suspend its military operations in and against Gaza. You predicted that wouldn't happen in any event. But my issue is that because of the fact that this eventually has to go to the United Nations Security Council, and in the inevitability of a provisional ruling, they would simply veto it. I mean, does the ICJ not have that particular power in order to grant it relief?
It has that power, and it acted on it in a very bizarre way. I don't want to go into details. it acted on it with Ukraine and Russia. But I don't want to go into the details. In general, it has not called for a cessation of military activities. It has not. My colleague Muin Rabbani has read through the old cases. I have not read through all of them.
Should it principle have not? Should it not have done that? I mean, from a principle point of view,
I didn't think it was possible for the very simple reason that because Hamas wasn't before the court, it would have been a one-sided, a unilateral calling for cessation of hostilities. It couldn't have been mutual because the court didn't have the power to make it mutual because Hamas is not a state and it's not before.
Well, what was the difference between the Ukraine and the Russia? Was that because there were allegations?
The Ukraine was so convoluted and so bizarre. It was completely ridiculous and it was completely political. And we all know that that's how the courts operate 99% of the time. Surprisingly, in the case of Palestine, it didn't, I have to say. I thought it was this thing was dead in the water. I was totally shocked by the vote. Though I have to say, not that I keep score, I claim now that I only was half wrong on the American judge. I said there's no possibility in the world that she's going to vote that Israel was plausibly committing genocide. Well, she did, but guess what? She then turned it back. So I think I get half a point. I don't get a goal, but I get something out of that. Now, if we turn, I have to watch the time. If we turn to what happened in the past week, formally speaking, you could say it's a tie because South Africa claimed that there is a imminent irreparable harm being done because of the starvation. Israel claims that's not the case, but there's a very big difference, a huge difference. And here is the difference. The difference is South Africa quoted UN authorities. It didn't quote its own government. It quoted international humanitarian organizations and it quoted UN organizations. What did Israel quote? The second person who came up, I guess her name was Torkeman. The second person who came up, all she did was quote generals, Israeli generals and Israeli officials.
Yeah.
So you cannot reasonably say that what's called in law evidence with interest, namely quoting your own government saying, hey, we aren't doing this, with evidence against interest, namely this was UN officials, have no dog in this race, UN officials, Secretary General, head of World Health Organization, head of World Food Program, Undersecretary for Humanitarian Affairs. They have no dog in the race. And they're saying that a mass starvation is imminent. So at that level, even though formally it's statement versus statement, in reality, it's statements with interest versus statements without interest. So you can't compare the two, in my opinion.
In fact, we South African case, and I'm not praising our government, but we did an 85 page application with about 500 footnotes.
Yeah, with all UN sources.
Israel didn't produce a written document. They argued from the bar, so we don't have a written document.
They did produce one, but it hasn't been publicly made available. They had this. You will recall they always refer to, if you look at tab 1, if you look at tab 2, if you look at tab 3, they're referring to a document that was submitted to the court, but for reasons I don't know, it hasn't been made publicly available, that document. My guess is the reason is obvious, because it only cites Israeli sources, which is
I see. She the lady who was doing the argument. We had, I believe you know John Dugard, right?
Yes, I know Mr. Dugard. Yeah. Professor Dugard. Yeah.
Professor Dugard. You know, since the application has happened, and I know times. Go ahead.
One last thing on that point.
Sure.
Now, I was informed this morning. I can't say with authority. I'm just saying I was informed this morning that something unusual happened. The court called back the South African delegation to answer Israel's claims yesterday. Now, I'm not aware of a precedent like that, but as we both agree, it was on the surface, somebody is clearly lying because it's black and white. We say there's a starvation, famine occurring because Israel is denying supplies. You say we're flooding the place with supplies. So something is not right there. And now the court has apparently called back the South African delegation. This is what I'm told. I was told this morning, to answer the Israeli claims. Now, I would say that's an unusual thing for several reasons. Number one, I don't know the court protocol, but I suspect that's because the president of the court is from Lebanon. I do not believe the American judge would have done that. And he probably exercised his prerogative, which is buried somewhere in the court protocol, that he has the right to do that. That's the only explanation I can see.
I wasn't aware of that because it hasn't certainly been reported here.
I got it from the inside, but I could be wrong. The second thing, which is critical, is if that's the case, now the whole of the presentation yesterday 2 days ago by South Africa was, we want the ceasefire. So they're a call for a ceasefire. So if they're calling back the South African delegation, it may be that they're taking seriously, unlike on January 26th, they're now taking seriously the demand for Israel for a ceasefire. I mean, that's my speculation. I could be wrong, obviously.
From a practical point of view, if there's a principal interim relief at this juncture for a ceasefire, as I understand, it doesn't have any kind of prosecutorial powers, but that will then go to the United Nations General Assembly, and of course then to Security Council on that particular issue. And certainly you're probably going to expect a veto from both either the United Kingdom and the United States. So I think it's just simply it'll have, you'll kind of have a split that the ICJ will then be in conflict with the Security Council on a core fundamental issue. And that'll be the first time in history where the Security Council disagrees with its own court, well, at least with the UN court, which will be unprecedented in modern history. I just want to take you to one thing which I need to pick your brains on, because you've been asked this so often in the media, and I've seen all your interviews with this character, Piers Morgan, and so on. You inevitably, in most kind of right-leaning media, you are inevitably taken back to what transpired on October 7th. And the discourse has been presented even in the mainstream media. And I don't know if we have time to share one particular issue. This character by the name of Dr. Phil. He was recently on his show, just recently had an interview with Netanyahu, but he presented the same idea of Hamas burning babies, decapitating babies, and so on. I've seen your response, and particularly the analogy that you've basically drawn with Nat Turner, which is a fantastic analogy, by the way, on that particular issue. But I was curious to know your specific response, particularly to outlets like the Electronic Intifada and The Intercept, which has in fact essentially called out the extremist Zionist atrocity propaganda. I mean, we obviously know there were no beheaded babies, but I mean, even the atrocity propaganda pertaining to rape, you have a situation where Yossi Landau, who's the head of the group called Zaka, he conceded in an interview with Al Jazeera that they were not children. When pressed with the idea of babies being burnt or being burnt in a crib, I mean, this narrative is still reaching out. My question to you is, in light of the New York Times article that Israel apparently knew about what was going to happen a year ago to the date of October 7th, Do you possibly not view this, as opposed to viewing it as a blowback by, Hamas, but possibly as some kind of, at some level, a false flag operation? Or at least, we know Israel is engaged in false flag operations like Operation Lavon and so on. On that day, the security was not operational. It was as if Hamas and whoever was there was allowed to enter. Do you not see something far more deeper? Israel engaged and invoked the Hannibal Directive, where they shot their own hostages. Do you not take that particular position as, do you not view that as a far more meaningful approach to adopt, as opposed to being in a position where we always have to be in the defense to say, look, this is a reality, this was coming, they've been kept in a concentration camp, whereas there's a more sinister element which involves Israel's direct involvement at some level?
There's no evidence for that, and I don't think we should go there.
What about the New York Times article, which spoke about the fact that Israel apparently knew about what was going to happen? They called it Operation Jericho.
Well, there are two things to say about that. Number one, the person who wrote the article, Mr. Bergman, he's basically an Israeli agent on the New York Times. Whether he's paid for it or not, to me, is beside the point. Roland Bergman basically is the Israeli agent, along with this Kirshner on the New York Times. Now, Israel obviously suffered a huge blow, not just public relations blow, but a shattering of its image on October 7th. Because Israel, up until that date, it still retained the reputation of being a kind of James Bond state writ large, with these high-tech commando operations which were supposed to awe the entire world. And suddenly on October 7th, its technical prowess, its James Bond-like image, was dealt a shattering blow. That being the case, Israel's capacity to terrorize the Arab world, what Israel calls its deterrence capacity, also suffered a huge blow, because it seemed as if, hey, Israel is not as invincible as we thought it was. So it's not altogether surprising that Roland Bergman would start writing these stories claiming, oh, we knew it all the time, because we're omniscient, we're all-knowing, we're the James Bond secret state that knows everything, or at least that's the image they wanted to project with their high-tech prowess. So one possible interpretation of Roland Bergman's article was that it was just an attempt by Israel to restore that shattered image of technical prowess, invincibility, and perfection. There is a second way to look at it, is if you look at 9/11 in the United States, there is no question there were 10,000 indications that Osama bin Laden would carry out an operation. But you have to remember, when you're in the United States, you're getting tons and tons and tons of information about plots here, plots there, plots everywhere. And then the question is, how much value do you attach to this piece of information versus that piece? There were people, for sure, there were people in the Bush administration who saw it coming. One of them wrote a quite good book on the subject, the name I forget now, by one of the intelligence people. But he said they just didn't pay attention to it because they have 10,000 reports and they didn't attach high priority to what, in retrospect, high priority should have been attached to. So it's quite possible that the Israelis, yes, some information crossed their desk that Hamas was going to do this, and Hamas.
I just want to. I know time to you. You have to go shortly, but just one last point on that issue, and then we're going to move on. The reports in the Haaretz, the Times of Jerusalem, and 972 magazine about the fact that on October 7th, Israel invoked the Hannibal Directive and deliberately targeted hostages that were being taken away. And so you see a convoy and the people who were burnt. I mean, Mark Regev on MSNBC with Mahdi Hassan stated that they burnt people, but they were Hamas fighters. I don't know how he made the distinction. What's your take on that? That it wasn't crossfire killing, but they were deliberately targeting their own civilians.
Okay. My take is very simple. First of all, I did not look at any of the footage from October 7th. I'm telling you that. No, I haven't looked at anything from October 7th onwards. I've seen pictures, photographs. I've not watched any footage. I'm telling you that straight out. I've talked with many people, however, who have looked at the situation very closely. And the consensus is, number one, Hamas's intention on October 7th was to deliver a shattering blow to the status quo. That makes sense to me. Number two, Hamas targeted Israeli military facilities and intelligence facilities. That makes sense to me. Number three, Hamas intended to take hostages. It's unclear at this point whether it intended to take military hostages and civilian hostages, or it intended to take only military hostages. Unclear. Number four, you may not like to hear it, but number four, they intended to carry out a civilian massacre, but we don't know the scale that they intended. What I would say in answer to your question is very, very simple. The numbers are, nobody seems to contest them at this point, 850 civilians were killed. Even if half, which I don't accept, but even if half were killed in friendly fire, that still leaves 400 civilians killed. And by any reckoning, 400 is a very large number. Let's be serious about it.
Yeah.
And it had to have been intentional. It couldn't have been 850 Israelis killed in crossfire or whatever, collateral damage, crossfire, whatever you want to call it. That's not plausible, in my opinion. Now, I acknowledge I didn't look at any of the footage. I don't believe a word that Israel says in the subject, and I don't believe a word that Hamas has to say in the subject. I disqualify both of them because too much interest. So that's evidence with interest. I don't accept it. But people who are knowledgeable in the topic, and it seems to me completely plausible, those four items. I do not believe there was any systematic rape. I've written on the subject. If you look at Pramila Patton's report, even though that was supposed to vindicate the Israeli case, in fact, it did just the opposite. Because what Pramila Patton's report showed was they looked at 5,000 photographs. They looked at 50 hours of digital digital footage. They looked at the footage from the Hamas webcams. They looked at the CCTV footage. They looked at the traffic footage. And that area was right next to Gaza. So it was probably the most surveilled area in all of Israel. They looked at all the footage, and what did they discover? They could not find one image, not one image of sexual violence. Well, that to me is a very telling admission. And then they said they couldn't find any forensic evidence, any of sexual violence. So I don't believe that.
There's a last question from the super chat before you go. What are Dr. Finkelstein's thoughts on religious identity and theological differences in Israel and Palestine? Will they serve as a basis for peace, or is it more likely that they'll continue to be manipulated? And I think you're on both sides of the spectrum, or at least particularly the far right in Israel. Any comments on that, Professor?
I don't think it's Netanyahu is not a particularly religious person. I don't gather that Gallant is a particularly religious issue.
They're surrounded by extremists, though.
Look, the whole place is extremist. Israel does not have a left. It doesn't even have a center. That's just a fact. Israel has a right, a far right, and an ultra right. That's its whole spectrum. There is no center in Israel. The closest to the center is Netanyahu at this point in Israeli life. And that is the right. And then there's the far right, and then there's the ultra right. So I don't think it's a religious versus secular issue. I think it's what Israel society has become. It's a lunatic state.
Last comment. What does your magic ball say? I mean, about the future. You've got a very pessimistic. I saw your 5-hour debate with that nutcase Destiny, and you had a very pessimistic future on what will happen. But anything positive to South Africans, to the members of the United Kingdom, citizens there? What would your magic ball say? Because you regularly quote Frederick Douglass. You say power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Do you not see the fact that the entire global opinion has changed forever against Israel, which was never the case before?
Well, I think that's premature to say. I'm old enough to remember, for example, public opinion after during Operation Cast Lead in 2008, 2009. There was a huge outpouring of support for the Palestinians. It didn't last. It vanished over time. And by the time Protective Edge in July, August 2014, there was very little reaction. People had become inured to Israel's mowings of the lawn. And so that huge outpouring of during Cast Lead, it pretty much vanished. Now, I don't know what's going to happen this time around. I can't predict that. What I could say is that there have been many new developments which nobody could possibly have predicted. There was South Africa going to bat for a powerless, stateless people. I would never have predicted that. There was a vote on the ICJ 15-2. I definitely did not predict that. There was a student movement which, with all the causes they could have seized upon, they could have seized upon climate change, they could have seized upon student tuition, they could have seized upon student debt, they could have seized upon 10,000 different challenges they face. They seized upon Gaza. A stateless, powerless people halfway around the world. These are all developments which nobody could have predicted. And right now, it's like what you could call, it's like a relay race. For a few months, all the attention was focused on the students for about a month, maybe 6 weeks. Now, graduation has occurred, so the students are out of the picture right now. But then the ICJ has South Africa has taken the baton again, and they're pressing their case in court. And who knows what somebody else or some other group might do tomorrow. It's a very tough battle. You're up against very concentrated power. You're up against ruthless people. And it's very, very hard to make a dent in it. The only thing you could say for certain is, if you don't do anything, nothing will change. The juggernaut will keep pushing until Israel achieves its aim, which is to make Gaza unlivable, uninhabitable. And then, once it's achieved that aim, there is still the looming battle with Hezbollah, who Israel will not forgive for having forced about 100,000 Israelis in the north to have to relocate. So the bottom line is, it's a very long battle. I think it's quite possible we're still closer to the beginning than to the end. And it's right now we're at the point of just chipping away at the power, trying to slow down that juggernaut a little bit here, a little bit there. The movement doesn't have concentrated force, doesn't have organization, doesn't have leadership. It's basically ad hoc and piecemeal at this point. I'm not faulting it. I'm just saying it. The students, the South Africa, each alone has been magnificent, but it's very tough. It's a very hard battle. And as I said, I think we might still be closer to the beginning than to the end.
Well, I want to thank you for that. I know, as promised, your time has come to. We would love to have picked your brains more, but we limited in time. I want to thank you because you continue giving people like yourself voice to the voiceless, and we hope to have you sometime again in the future, Professor. It's been a privilege and an honor speaking with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
Appreciate that.
Yeah. So, brothers and sisters, thank you for joining us. That's been an excellent lesson on history and conflict and much more. I really hope you enjoyed it. Brother Yusuf, I hope you, mashallah, enjoyed your one-to-one with the professor.
No,
I think it's very beneficial.
Absolutely. I met, he doesn't remember, but we met with a group of people in 2008. He's obviously been extremely busy. We'd like to have had him for more than an hour, but time was just at a premium for him, and he's extremely busy researching and studying. And he did, in fact, tell me that after this engagement, he's going into another engagement. So he has been overwhelmed since October 7th with commitments and with engagements. I think he's a regular now on the Piers Morgan show, where we see him quite often, just involved in a debate last week. So we hope to have more such sessions in the future. And we hope that the viewers out there enjoyed the studio. We will be now, as you can see, Brother Mohammed, both and the South African Debate Initiative, both our channels will be live streaming events of this particular nature. And we hope to establish a good partnership with each other on this and other related issues. Thank you once again, Brother Mohammed, and to the viewers out there. Till next time, greetings of peace, and may the struggle and the resistance continue, inshallah.
Of course. And we'll still continue to do our weekly updates on the conflict in Gaza. We'll definitely continue with that with next week. And let me just give a shout out to our brother's channel, the South African Debate Initiative. Go onto it, guys. Click onto the subscribe and bell icon. Let's get the subscribers up, inshallah. It hasn't been that active in the past, but now, inshallah, with this beautiful partnership, for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that we will boost up the subscribers. But once again, thank you, Brother Yusuf, for behind the scenes, all the logistical stuff. Bless you, mashallah. May Allah make it easy for you and all the brothers and sisters in the chat. And please, wherever you are, whatever part of the world you are, don't forget to make dua for our brothers and sisters who are going through this horrific, moment in history. And it will always be written in history what's taking place. It will never forget, subhanAllah. May Allah make it easy for the brothers and sisters in Palestine, in Gaza, the West Bank, and all across the world. May Allah make it easy for them. Ameen. Jazakumullah khair for watching, and mashallah, don't forget to like, subscribe. Final word from myself and our beloved elder, Brother Yusuf. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.